To all Canberrans. We're going to go live though now to Melbourne, where the Liberal MP Kevin Andrews has kindly agreed to talk to us about the latest in the citizenship fiasco. Good morning, Kevin.
Good morning, Sam.
What do you think needs to happen now? The Prime Minister has outlined a time frame that would see people produce their documents by December the 18th, although he said that he's prepared to move on that. Labor wants it done and dusted by December 1. What's your view of what needs to happen?
Two things, Sam. Firstly, I'm pleased that we've moved on to trying to resolve the issue rather than pretending that there wasn't an issue or somehow it was just going to go away if we did nothing about it. But secondly, there are problems with the current proposal. As I understand it, it won't be the subject of a motion in Parliament until we return in 3 weeks' time. It's then being talked about having a period of 21 days or another 3 weeks for members and senators to provide information. It's not clear on what I've seen as to what then happens. Does the Committee on Members' Interests in both the House and the Senate consider what's being provided and provide a report to each chamber? And that's if the resolutions of each chamber are the same. That takes us up close to Christmas. If a matter has to be referred then to the High Court, it doesn't sit, I believe, until February of next year. So you could see arguments on a particular by-election case, nomination, constitutional case in February next year, maybe not a decision until March next year. And then you have a 33-day period if a by-election needs to be called before that can be held. So the prospect of this continuing for months into the future, I think, is unsettling to Australians that have spoken to me about it, and we need a much quicker process to deliver an outcome.
OK, so what are you proposing then?
Well, what I proposed was an audit which could have been undertaken right now. It doesn't take a long time, I suspect, in the case of almost all members of Parliament to determine their ancestry. People can go on ancestry.com and find out this sort of information within half an hour to an hour. Yes, there may be a few more difficult cases and that could be looked at by the experts, but surely we can truncate the period in which this is occurring, because from a political perspective this is doing enormous damage in terms of the government not being able to get out its message. We can't talk about cost of living pressures on ordinary Australians and how we are seeking to resolve that. We can't talk about the myriad of problems because this is dominating the news cycle. OK, Richard Di Natale has suggested that we're headed towards an early election. Do you think that's where this is going to end up if too many MPs are referred to the High Court, or is there a way to keep the government stable and get things back on track? Look, I can't speculate about hypotheticals of what might happen in terms of whether or not one or a number of MPs and senators are referred to the High Court and what the High Court might decide. Anything along those lines is pure speculation about hypothetical situations. But what's important is that we do have clear, stable and decisive government in Australia. I know that in the House, Ms McGowan, the member for Indi, has said that she would continue to support the government, and I'd hope that the crossbenchers would continue to do so while we sort this mess out. But the key thing at the moment is to get it sorted quickly and not allow this to drag on, as it could, up until March, April or longer next year.
Mr Di Natale has also suggested that he thinks that the Prime Minister may not survive until Christmas. You've spoken before about how you think that voters are sick of the revolving door of Prime Ministers, but do you think, given how unstable the situation is, that you could rule out a leadership change in the Liberal Party before the end of the year?
Well, as I said last week, Sam, I'm not aware of any moves to replace Mr Turnbull as the Prime Minister. As I've said constantly and continuously, voters are sick of the revolving door at the Lodge, where we've had a series of Prime Ministers over the last few years. That's not a good outcome, and that could only be contemplated as a very, very last measure, a measure of very last resort. But I'm certainly not contemplating it. I'm not aware of any discussions with colleagues that are contemplating that at the present time. What we've got to do is resolve the immediate issue before the Parliament, and to do that as quickly as possible.
What would constitute the circumstances under which you'd have to reach for that last resort?
Look, again, that's speculation, Sam. I'm not going there. I'm not contemplating going there because, as I said, Australians are sick and tired of this mess. They want clear, stable, decisive government. They want us to get on with the job. And the first test of getting on with the job, I think, is to resolve this issue of the citizenship as quickly and as decisively and prudently as possible.
The Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, has also been accused of having a tantrum on breakfast television this morning with Karl Stefanovic. Do you think that he has the temperament to be a long-term political leader in Australia?
I'm afraid, Sam, I wasn't watching Karl this morning, so what you've mentioned is news to me. I've been out doing other things so far as my electorate is concerned. Look, Malcolm is the Prime Minister. As I said, there is not an appetite to be changing Prime Ministers all the time. It's important that Prime Ministers listen to their colleagues, listen to the Australian people, learn about the challenges and how we should respond to them, and then put in place a program which they can be resolute about prosecuting in the Parliament and in the public square.
Okay, we are going to have this fight, some people would call it. Democracy, I suppose, is the nicer word for the Senate presidency. Are you surprised that the Special Minister of State, Scott Ryan, is prepared to bail on a ministerial job to take up that role?
The President of the Senate is one of the most significant and prestigious positions within the Australian parliamentary system. We've had great presidents of the Senate on both sides over the years, and for any senator to aspire to that office, I think, is a good thing. It's a good ambition, if I can put it that way, and if Senator Ryan believes that he could do the job and represent not just the Senate but on many occasions Australia more broadly, then that's a good thing to aspire to.
Do you think, though, that if it's an opportunity to have a ministerial reshuffle, that there's anything that the Prime Minister needs to give thought to? Does he need to bring in perhaps someone with a little experience, such as yourself, or is there a need to balance the ministerial ranks, for example, in terms of bringing in more Conservatives?
I've said this on many occasions in the past, so I'm not saying anything to you, Sam, that I haven't said before. As John Howard famously described it, the Liberal Party is a broad church. It's a broad church that represents two great philosophic traditions, classic liberalism and also social conservatism. And my observation is, and the observation of many people who speak to me, is that the Liberal Party is at its best, works best and represents the Australian people best when it truly represents that broad church of Liberals and Conservatives.
Okay, and just finally, the Northern Territory Government is, of course, considering, again, asking for the right to legislate on euthanasia. This was a debate that you were intensely involved with at the time. Should the Northern Territory now have the right in this day and age to make their own laws when it comes to that issue?
Look, my position hasn't changed on this, Sam, but you know this is premature anyway. The proposed legislation has not passed the Victorian Parliament at this stage. As I understand, there's then a period, if it does pass, of some time before it would come into operation. The prudent thing to do here, even if you're in favour of these changes, would be to see how this works in practice so far as Victoria is concerned, if in fact it does pass the Victorian Parliament. We know from other jurisdictions that this has led to an ever-increasing widening of the category of people who can call or ask for assisted suicide. I am troubled about that, and so I wouldn't be rushing to endorse any changes elsewhere until at least we see what's happening in Victoria.
And just in terms of that issue of delaying things until the picture is clear, Cory Bernardi, of course, wants to delay the same-sex marriage vote until the constitutionality of Parliament is confirmed. Do you share his view that it should be delayed until next year?
Look, I don't have a view in terms of how quickly or otherwise it should pass in terms of this year or next year or weeks or months or whatever. But my view is that what we have to ensure in this legislation is that there is adequate protection for freedom of religion and belief. The Dean Smith bill has virtually no protection for religion and belief. in its terms. It's very narrow. It doesn't even apply to all marriage celebrants, and it only applies to the wedding ceremony itself. The things that are contained in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights are entirely absent from Senator Smith's bill, and what I want to see, if the yes vote should be the choice of the Australian people, then we have adequate protection for freedom of religion and belief, including the belief that I don't have any particularly theistic belief. So that's what I'm concerned about, and I want that to be approached in a prudent way, and whatever time it takes, because it's better to have prudent appropriate legislation than something which is rushed through, which we will all regret later.
All right, Kevin Andrews in Melbourne, we thank you for your time though this morning. We appreciate it.
My pleasure, Sam, and I hope you back the Oaks winner.
I'm not a betting lady, but I'll keep that in mind. Thank you for that today.